What if the plague that killed half of Europe had never arrived? In October 1347, 12 Genoese ships sailed into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The ships carried more than cargo. They carried death. The passengers and crew were infected with a terrifying illness that caused black boils, fever, and almost certain death within days. This was the Black Death, and it would change the course of European history forever. The plague moved fast. It traveled along trade routes from Asia, through the Middle East, and into Europe. Rats carried infected fleas, and the fleas carried the bacteria to humans. Within just a few years, the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. In some cities, more than half the population died in a matter of months. The social impact was devastating. Fields were abandoned because there were no workers to farm them. Cattle roamed freely. Shops closed. Churches overflowed with bodies. The economy stopped. Families were destroyed as parents, children, and neighbors died together. The medieval world, already fragile, seemed to be ending before people's eyes. But what if the Black Death had never happened? What if those ships had been turned away, or the plague had remained contained in Central Asia? The world we live in today might be dramatically different. To understand how, we have to look at what the plague actually changed. Without the Black Death, Europe's population would have continued to grow rapidly throughout the late 1300s and 1400s. More people would have meant larger cities, more consumers, and more soldiers. However, it also would have meant more pressure on food supplies, more competition for land, and possibly more conflicts between kingdoms over territory and resources. One of the biggest effects of the plague was a severe labor shortage. With so many workers dead, survivors could demand higher wages. Lords who had once controlled peasants suddenly had to compete for labor. This helped break down the feudal system, where peasants were tied to the land. Without the plague, feudalism might have lasted much longer, keeping most people trapped in poverty and servitude. After the plague, women gained new opportunities because labor was scarce. They took over family businesses, worked in trades, and inherited property more often. Without the demographic shock, traditional gender roles might have remained stricter for centuries. The path toward greater economic and social independence for women could have been much slower. The Black Death shook people's faith. Many asked why God would allow such suffering. Some turned to extreme religious movements, while others began to question the Church's authority. This contributed to religious reforms and eventually the Protestant Reformation. Without the plague, the Catholic Church might have maintained even stronger control over European society and politics. The plague forced doctors to study disease more seriously. Although they did not understand bacteria, they began to question old ideas about humors and miasma. Quarantine was invented in Italian city-states to stop the spread. Without this deadly push, medical science and public health practices might have advanced much more slowly. Modern hospitals and sanitation could be very different today. The disaster weakened the medieval worldview and opened space for new ideas. The Renaissance and scientific revolution were partly fueled by a desire to understand the natural world more accurately after the plague showed the limits of old explanations. A Europe that never experienced the Black Death might have remained more traditional and less curious about science for a longer time. With fewer workers, wages rose and surviving peasants had more money to spend. This created demand for goods and helped fuel the growth of towns and markets. At the same time, some nobles became poorer because they could no longer extract as much labor from peasants. Without the plague, wealth might have stayed concentrated among the landed aristocracy for much longer. The social changes caused by the plague helped set the stage for later revolutions. When ordinary people gained economic power, they also began to demand political rights. The breakdown of feudalism was a long process, but the Black Death accelerated it dramatically. Without that acceleration, absolute monarchs might have ruled Europe for many more centuries. A larger European population might have explored and colonized the Americas differently. More people could have meant bigger expeditions and faster conquest. However, it might also have meant more disease-carrying Europeans arriving sooner, which would have devastated indigenous populations even earlier than it did in our timeline. But a world without the Black Death would not necessarily be better. A larger population could have led to more wars, famines, and environmental destruction. Europe might have become overpopulated long before industrial agriculture could support it. Sometimes historical disasters create opportunities that would never have existed otherwise. If the Black Death had never happened, the modern world might be richer, more crowded, more traditional, and less scientifically advanced. Or it might have developed along completely different lines that we cannot predict. What is certain is that the plague was one of history's great turning points, and without it, our world would be unrecognizable.